Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to it. Welcome back to probably coming up on a really crazy week, right? We got a really crazy week coming up. Y'all got retreat, right? We're coming off of like Founders Day. It feels kind of like a mishmash, and that AP test keeps getting closer and closer. But just know that we're in a really good spot, right? We're in a really, really good spot. Y'all aren't going to be missing anything more than one class day for retreat. We're going to get all this stuff figured out. You're reading your Communist Manifesto. I know McKenna's just like, rah, like, and all this other stuff, right? We're going to talk about it whenever you get back to class. We're also going to talk about how that's mirrored in this flip a little bit. We're going to talk a lot about socialism and Marxism towards the end. We're going to talk about like one of these other little, one of these little countries in the background and stuff like that. And we're going to talk about, I know Abigail one again is just like, oh, you tried. You gave it a shot. Now, anyway, but the big thing about it, though, is we left off in class talking about the Dreyfus Affair, right? The Dreyfus Affair being a massive image of anti-Semitic activity that is occurring in Europe during the late 1800s, right? Because everything we're talking about right now is all this crazy political stuff in the late 1800s that's going into World War I and going to help cause it, which I know Claire Kirsch is very excited about learning about some World War I, right? Is that right, Claire Kirsch? Tanks and trenches and rah! Like, so the big thing about it, though, is also you have to understand, though, that the Dreyfus Affair, its story is very, very good, but it's also going to have massive effects politically as well, right? Because what's going to end up happening is during the Dreyfus Affair, you are going to see that split in France, right, between the politicians. You're going to see politicians that are going to split and become like pro-nationalist French state, and then you're going to have the conservative, pro-Catholic, anti-Semite side, right? So the thing about it is like even some of these French politicians are going to begin to create anti-Semitism into their actual platforms, right? Like into their speeches and things like that, and try to use it to garner votes and all these other things. And speaking of garnering votes and stuff, we will talk about like professional anti-Semitism, which is one of the most disgusting things I've ever said in my entire life. When we get actually into like Austria here in a second, when we talk about on the next slide, we'll talk about the mayor of Austria and how he kind of used the same kind of thing. But that split is going to be dramatic in France during the Dreyfus Affair. Emile Zola, a liberal journalist, is going to write that article, J'accuse, right? Like it actually kind of demonstrate to the French people that this entire trial was pretty fabricated and really, really screwed up from the get, right? Like so, and then that guy Esterhazy was the real culprit for smuggling those plans into Germany Germany at this time. It wasn't Prussia anymore. Now, the Dreyfus Affair, though, because of these things, because of like people like Emile Zola, and because of all this other crazy stuff going on, is going to see the formal split in church and state in France. You're going to see bishops and priests are now going to be solely paid by the church. Catholic schools are going to lose upward of 30% of their students because they lost their government funding. And then also all churches were governed by lay people and councils, not the state anymore, right? This is going to help solidify the French government as the very first and one of the earliest truly nationalist states in Europe during this time period. It's going to garner a lot of like sympathies and a lot of exuberance towards the French state and a lot of pride in the French people. And this is again going to be another kind of little like stone in this big Jenga tower that is going to be leading up to World War I. Now, in the wake of these bad economic events, in the like actual stock market crash of the 1870s and all the other things that like helped lead to the Dreyfus Affair, in the wake of all these things, you're going to see a new term pop up. And that term is going to be called political Zionism, right? Which is sometimes today in some circles seen as kind of a dirty word, right? But you have to understand its implications, its start, its finish. You have to be able to look at it both historically, both from the forward and the back, and you also have to understand that if you understand what happened to the Jewish population several thousand years ago when they actually diasporaed throughout Europe, that they did have claim to some lands and things like that in places like Israel, but at the same time, they had been gone for several thousand years, so of course other people are going to populate that area, known as the Palestinians, right? But again, we're going to talk about all that stuff here in a second, but the idea of political Zionism is the idea or the concept that the Jewish people deserve like a homeland, a political state, right? The country of Israel is the Zionist goal, and it does exist. So as you can see, the Zionist movement was successful, right? There's going to be this thing later on called the Balfour Declaration after World War I that's going to help solidify that entire concept, but we'll get to that stuff here in a second. But political Zionism, in a nutshell, is the movement towards a Jewish political nationhood. And the Dreyfus Affair helped inspire it dramatically, because you're going to see the growth of actual Zionists, in particular, the actual main Zionist, the guy that actually invented the entire concept of Zionism, right? His name was Theodor Herzl, right? Theodor Herzl, who is actually pictured right here as well, was a French Jewish person who actually you would probably consider like a secular Jewish person, right? He's kind of like a Creaster Catholic. He like only went to temple when he absolutely needed to. He did not know how to speak Hebrew or Yiddish, right? He was Jewish by ethnicity and like faith, but he was not a devout Jewish person. He actually was also a German nationalist early on. He believed that German people should actually be united and actually should have their own country. He is a playwright. And also, the other big thing about it is he created Zionism as the answer to anti-Semitism, right? He believed that creating the Jewish home state and having a nation for Jewish people would be the only way to end anti-Semitism. Now, this was not his original idea. His original idea to end anti-Semitism was actually to just have all the Jewish people convert to Christianity, but this is when he was young, right? When he was a young man and he was like an upstart and he was trying to figure out a way to help his people, help himself, and help these different countries. The thing about it was he thought honestly that if we just had a mass conversion to Christianity, would anti-Semitism necessarily exist? Whereas a lot of rabbis and other Jewish leaders told him, it's like, dude, anti-Semitism is going to exist. People are always looking for someone to blame, right? And the Jewish people have always been blamed for a very long period of time, right? So the thing about it, though, is during the Dreyfus Affair, that's when Herzl gets inspired about Zionism. That's when he starts giving speeches. That's when he starts demanding the actual creation of a Jewish homeland, right? And that's where the political Zionist movement is going to come from. And it's going to gain a lot of steam up underneath his lead. Now, ironically enough, it did split the Jewish populations a little bit. There were a lot of Jewish people that also thought that this was not the answer, that we needed to figure out a way to be able to live happily in other countries, that we didn't necessarily need to create a home state. And then there were a lot of Zionists that believed that this concept was going to be the best thing to do, right? Now, the other thing about it, though, is that Zionism is going to continue to stir that pot and continue to kind of create a very large descent from non-Jewish people onto Jewish people. One of the best examples of this is a guy named Karl Luger, right? Karl Luger was the former mayor of Vienna, and he actually used anti-Semitism in his platform. That's what we were talking about in the last slide, right? That some of these French politicians are going to use it. Well, Karl Luger is an Austrian politician, and he is going to directly use ideas of anti-Semitism to try and help. Pierre, what are you eating? Pierre, stop eating that, please. Oh my God. Literally eating a hitchhiker from outside. That is gross. All right, so now look. So the big thing about it, not a hitchhiker like a person. That wasn't a person outside or anything, and then my dog ate him. I mean like one of the little seeds. Now, anyway, so the big thing about it, though, is Karl Luger is going to use anti-Semitic rhetoric when he's trying to get elected for mayor of Vienna several times, right? He is actually going to directly say that we should separate from these people, and he also helps create this thing called the Jewish problem or the Jewish question, right? And the thing about it is, though, it's very uncomfortable to talk about this sometimes, but Karl Luger also then directly inspired Adolf Hitler. When Hitler was a young man living in Austria, he listened to Luger, read his speeches, heard his speeches, and also we believe that his father actually voted for Karl Luger, right? And so you have to understand is that this professional anti-Semitism is going to kind of make this entire problem way worse. But the weirdest thing about it was, when asked about his personal beliefs, Karl Luger actually himself did not harbor a ton of anti-Semitic beliefs. I know. He actually made up most of those stuffs just to get elected, right? He is the creative, not creative, but he's kind of an example of what you would refer to as a populist, right? A populist is going to try and use and garner sentiment using popular fervor and stuff. But no, many Jewish people that knew Karl Luger were like, he is a kind, gracious, and chivalrous man, right? And the other weird thing about it is, though, is like that debated personal belief is, did he really dislike Jewish people? Or was he just trying to make a career out of being a politician? It's a very, very kind of uncomfortable thing to think about, right? Now, one big thing that we do know about Luger was that he did demonstrate some other crazy stuff that was going on. Luger prevented the immigration of Russian-expelled Jewish people, right? So if there are Russian-expelled Jewish people, that means that want to immigrate into Austria, then we need to discuss what is happening that's causing these Jewish people to leave Russia, right? And a lot of it has to do with these Russian leaders that come after Alexander II. So Alexander II is our guy that we talked about already that is going to end feudalism and stuff like that. But of course he gets assassinated. The guy that takes over after him is Alexander III, his brother, right? And so his brother is not progressive and not very into this idea of liberal constitutional monarchies and also liberal legislative bodies and things like that. He wants to keep the old monarchy the way it always has been. He eventually dies and Nicholas II takes over, the biggest idiot on the planet, and we'll talk about him a little bit later on as well, and his whole role in the second wave of Russian modernization. But they tried to channel dissent away from them. They tried to channel criticism away from themselves and have it put onto the 4 million Jewish people that lived inside of Russia, right? So the thing about it is, in this political cartoon, as you can see, that right there is one of the Russian czars, and this is, ironically enough, Theodore Roosevelt. And he's trying to demonstrate and show the actual, like, disgusting treatment of Jewish people in Russia during this time period, right? So you have to understand, Alexander III and Nicholas II wanted to create opposition against Jewish people to make it so they weren't being dissented on by Russian people, right? Military and police are going to create these things and enact these things known as the pogroms, right? The pogroms is a disgusting thing that you need to do me a favor and highlight because it's a very important concept. The pogroms, though, is when basically Russian peasants were encouraged to raid, loot, burn, and kill Jewish communities, right? Literally, regular Russian peasants were told to destroy things, loot things, and kill children and people individually to destroy Jewish villages, while the military and the police would stand by and watch, right? So the Jewish people had no safety whatsoever in this entire area, right? Or in Russia whatsoever. 2.75 million out of the 4 million Jewish people that lived in Russia actually did immigrate. And this picture right here, which is absolutely horrifying, is actually a picture from some of the pogroms in 1903 that actually demonstrate Russian men holding the bodies of dead Jewish children, showing off as if they did a good thing, right? It is an absolutely horrifying thing that is going to occur, and it actually demonstrates to you that the fervor and the intense violence that actually is going to lead to the Holocaust was not a brand new thing in the 1940s, and it existed for some time. And also, the other big thing that I like to bring up as well is I know that we had an American president trying to point out the Jewish hatred and stuff like that on a European power and things like that, but something you also need to understand is that America had its own problems too. This right here is of showing of the Tulsa race massacre of 1918, when literally an entire neighborhood of prosperous middle-class black individuals was destroyed by a white race mob, by a white hate mob that was trying to destroy them and kill their community after a botched court case and stuff like that happened, okay? And this happened in Oklahoma right after World War I. So if any of you have questions about the Tulsa Race Massacre, if you want me to talk about it a little bit in class, just raise your hand and be like, hey, Mr. Terry, I would like to learn more about this. Can you explain what happened? I know Sam Johnson might be kind of interested in it, Gabriella Rufino. Just let me know, okay? And we'll talk more about it. But the pogroms are disgusting and awful, but it is important to know that these things were going on in in America as well, just not towards Jewish people, right? And so the thing is, continuing forward, one other little thing you just need to know in the back of your mind, real quick, we're not going to spend long on it, is Austria, the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Habsburgs, the Austrian Empire, becomes Austria-Hungary in 1867, okay? So after the Austro-Prussian War, the Austrians under Franz Joseph decide to give dual rulership to both Austrians and Hungarians to try and not make it so it's just the Austrians being in charge anymore, that Hungarians and Austrians are on equal footing. So in 1867, they become Austria-Hungary. So just to give you a heads up, so Austria-Hungary is looking less at being completely Austrian and actually kind of embracing this multitude of ethnicities that live in their country. And we got to talk really quickly. Last but very not least, we are moving into the one country in the background this whole time that we haven't been talking about. And it's these guys.
British people be like, it's Tuesday, innit? British people watching Spider-Man be like, Peter Parker. British people be like, can I get a bowl of water?
Exactly. Can I get a bowl of water? So, the big thing about it is we have to discuss the Bastion of Great Britain, right? Now, the Bastion of Great Britain is referring to the idea that on the outside of their country, from the exterior perspective, Great Britain appeared as if they were this gigantic, just leading light, guiding light, amazing, progressive, liberal state that was having a very intense war between a conservative House of Lords and a liberal House of Commons, right? The Bastion of Great Britain, of course, represented by their female, what's the word I'm looking for? Effigy, right? So this is the image of London and Great Britain, right? A very posed, progressive woman handing out an olive branch, also sitting around gold, and also the shield protecting her great empire, right? So the big thing about it, though, that you also need to remember is who is in charge right now. So go ahead and jot this down. You have three major parties involved, or three major groups that are involved right now inside of Great Britain, right? You have what's known as the Labour Party, which is going to be the liberal progressive party, and that is going to be dominating much of the House of Commons. You then have the Tories, right, or the Conservative Party, that is dominating the House of Lords, and then is also present in the House of Commons. And then your third group is the monarchy, of course, as it always has been. It's Queen Victoria, right? This is the Victorian era of Great Britain. Very, very intense. Go watch Sherlock Holmes if you want kind of a nice image of Victorian era London. Very, very steampunk-esque. It's not really an accurate description of it, but it's still really important. But the big thing about it is Great Britain was seen as a guiding example due to the fact that this liberal progressive party was able to push through liberal agendas under the guise of their organizer, David Lloyd George, which is a very intense name. Now, the big thing about it, though, so you understand, is that they were pushing through things like the People's Budget, right? Great Britain had 99% universal male suffrage, okay? Higher tax rates on the wealthy. They created a national health insurance policy in the late 1800s. They created public schools. They created old age insurance, right? They were doing this stuff right alongside of Germany when they were doing it, even though Otto von Bismarck extended universal suffrage to every man over the age of 25, just saying. But the big thing about it, though, is that Great Britain appeared to be a very progressive state. This entire People's Budget that created the higher taxes on the wealthy for national health insurance, for public schools, for compulsory education, and also for Social Security was actually only vetoed once by that progressive or by that conservative House of Lords. So on the outside, Great Britain appeared to the rest of the nations to be this very, very intense Republican Democratic government that was passing very, very progressive agendas, right? So, but the big thing you got to understand is that is there something they're hiding? Is there something going on internally inside of their empire that they're hiding? And of course there is, right? So of course there is. And the big thing that's happening is the Irish home rule question, right? Are these my islands or yours, right? Discussing the idea to back up this idea of like John Bull and trying to create this progressive concept of Irish home rule, right? So the big thing about it that you have to understand is the big lingering questions going into World War I that is greatly affecting Great Britain is the fact that the Great Famine had devastated Ireland's ability to function economically, to like they had massive immigration issues where like many of them were leaving, a lot of them going to the United States. We will discuss this also in the next unit when we talk about the entirety of the Great Migration period that's going on in Great Britain during this time. And then also during this moment when Britain refused to provide subsequent aid to Ireland, right? Not refused, but did not provide intensive subsequent labor reform-based aid, social-based aid to Ireland. This is going to raise the concept of Irish home rule, where Ireland does not necessarily want to be removed from the empire, but they want a progressive government that they elect that runs their island, that represents their people, right? Now, the big problem with this thing of Irish home rule, the idea of creating a lower house of parliament in Ireland where they can function, pass their own laws, take care of their own people, things like that, is coming under heavy protest, right? Because a lot of people believe that if you give them home rule, then they're eventually going to break away and become an independent country, which, looking down the road, does happen, right? So, as in the late 1940s, I think it's late 1940s, Ireland becomes completely separate, right? Becomes completely separate with regards to the tiny northern region of Ireland. Northern Ireland, right? So now to understand this issue of the divided Ireland, you got to know the difference between the bulk of Southern Ireland and tiny Northern Ireland, right? Tiny Northern Ireland is represented by one very, very large city, an area known as Ulster, right? Ulster, right? So in Southern Ireland is represented mostly by Dublin and the larger cities like Cork that actually exist in Southern Ireland, right? Or Southern Ireland, right? Southern Ireland is overwhelmingly Catholic, right? So, and Northern Ireland is Protestant. They're Anglican Protestant, right? They're English-style Protestants. So you were seeing a very big economic divide between these two areas. Northern Ireland was economically very prosperous, whereas Southern Ireland was not, all right? So you got a lot of issues going on through this. And ironically enough, Home Rule was passed for Ireland in 1914, but was stonewalled by World War I, right? Due to massive protests, due to lobbying via the Labour Party, through Irish nationalists that had been elected to Parliament in Great Britain, they did successfully get Home Rule passed and this was to the chagrin and worry of Ulster, right? So Ulster and Northern Ireland did not want to be a part of Southern Ireland. This is going to lead to many, many, many more problems down the road when we talk about like the Easter Uprising and their own version of Bloody Sunday and things like that. Well, the Easter Uprising was actually earlier. So they passed Home Rule, but they said they would not effectively start Home Rule until after World War I ended, and then past 1918, they still actually took quite some time to establish a true Home Rule thing. This is an issue that we will revisit, but it is important to know that the Irish Home Rule question is coming up before World War I, and then will be addressed again after World War I, right? So that is Great Britain's big problem is Ireland a part of their entire area? See, Ulster's prayer, do not let us go, right? Because they're trying to say that, oh, these are the impoverished areas and the prosperity province is in Northern Ireland, right? And of course, there is John Bull right there. So then also going forward, no Home Rule. Every time you see the red hand right there, that is the red hand of Ulster, right? So they're saying, la 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 la, that Ulster wants to stay with Great Britain, right? And then, of course, this is more propaganda from the people that want Ireland to stay a part of Great Britain, which was a little ridiculous and everything by this point, but it says radicalism, inefficient army and navy, Home Rule, a disunited empire will lead us into ruin, right? So basically the idea that if you let Ireland become an independent state or have Home Rule, it will lead them into ruin, which ironically enough in the modern era, that still is yet to happen. So now anyway, but big thing you also need to understand is on the back burner going on in the background are massive Marxist and socialist uprisings and movements are going on, okay? So this is the thing that we kind of talked about when we read our Communist Manifesto, and we kind of understood where Marx was coming from. We were talking about that. We talked about how certain elements of the manifesto have a little tinge of naiveness to them, right? So when it comes to certain different ideas, and we'll talk about how Edward Bernstein also agreed with that a little bit later. But you've got a lot of stuff going on. Like, for example, on this cup, this coffee cup, or tea cup actually, is meant to commemorate the Blackburn riots in May of 1878, which was started out as a nonviolent protest in England to accomplish socialist agendas through a labor union that actually, by this point, was being allowed to finally strike and do certain things, and then the police officers are going to retaliate with violent action. So socialism and Marxism are going on in the background, right? And they have been going on for a long time. And big thing that you need to understand is that I just referenced an event that happened in Great Britain. But socialism is not exclusive to each country. It's actually an international movement. You should definitely underline that. Definitely highlight that. Big thing you need to understand is that Karl Marx himself said, working men have no country. The idea that socialism and Marxism span every country, that working men are united together, not to their flag, okay? So socialist parties are beginning to grow in every single country. Germany is a great example. Remember Otto von Bismarck tried to prevent the growth of socialist parties using his anti-socialist laws. He then tried to placate the common worker that was now beginning to vote heavily socialist during the late 1870s when he was still in power by giving old age insurance and accident insurance and disability insurance and these other different agendas. But that did not slow down the growth of socialism in Germany. By the time that Bismarck was dismissed and going into World War I, the Social Democratic Party, the Socialist Party of Germany, was the majority inside of the Reichstag, right? So socialism is growing pretty efficiently, right? And then there's a big, intense growing, again, a second wave of socialist growth right when Marx dies, right? Karl Marx died in 1888, and you're going to see a massive growth of socialism again, right? Now, it's important to understand that socialism went through like two waves. So you had to understand that socialism went through two great waves, right? So right around 1850, socialism is going to begin to kind of very much grow, coming off the publication of the Communist Manifesto and also coming off the growing ideals of those isms coming out of the revolutions of 1848. That's where your first wave of growth is going to occur. And during that first wave of growth, you're going to see the creation of international socialist working men's parties, right? So, and right around 1850, though, the first one died off, right? So you saw a plateau of socialist growth for a slight bit of time from about the years of 1850 1850 to 1888, right? But then in 1888, Marx is going to die. And when he dies, you're going to see that massive growth, a resurgence of growth in radical socialist movements and also Marxist movements as well. But really quick question to jump back to 1850, why did that first one die off? Well, the first International Working Men's Party died off a little bit because Marxists, anarchists, and socialists are going to begin to kind of disagree on motive, method, and modus operandi, how they're going to operate and what they're going to get, right? But they did agree on some things early on. For example, May Day, May the 1st. Did you know that May the 1st is considered a national strike day where no man that is of a working party or a socialist party is supposed to work, right? And it's still celebrated to this day a lot in Europe. I personally believe that AP European, we should have just a party on May Day and just celebrate all of our hard work, you know what I mean? We'll discuss that actually in class. But who is stuff like this going to terrify? Who is the formation of socialist working men's parties going to terrify? Who is this going to freak out? The conservatives and the middle class, right? So the big thing is to try and avoid the growth of these socialist movements, to try and avoid the growth of these like different things. What the conservatives and the middle class are going to do is they're going to try to pacify the worker, to avoid barricades, right? So concessions are going to be made to these large groups that are the Second International Working Men's Socialist Party and things like that, right? So for example, from 1888, when this big wave of socialism begins to return, you're going to see wage increases by 2 times, right? From 1850 to 1900, you saw wages increase by double, right? You're going to see voting rights beginning to be extended to try and prevent the growth of socialist uprisings or any violent action. You're going to see quality of life in cities is going to rise. Edwin Chadwick, sewer systems, the reduction of cholera outbreaks, and the legalization and growth of labor unions that are allowed officially as of the 1870s to strike. It becomes legal for them to strike and actually form picket lines, right? So very, very big stuff. And one of the best examples of these actions was the Match Girl strike of 1888, right? So there were these match girls that worked for the Bryant and Mays Match Company, right? Bryant and Mays matches made these things known as Lucifer matches or white phosphorus matches, right? White phosphorus Lucifer matches could be struck on any surface and they would ignite and create the flame, right? But the thing about it is you got to understand the people that work in this Bryant and Mays factory, right? So in the Bryant and Mays factory, to make these white Lucifer matches that could be struck on absolutely anything, right? On any surface. That's why strike anywhere matches have a little tiny little white tip to them. It's because of white phosphorus, right? So the people that worked inside of that factory, though, were mostly young women. Immigrant women, a lot of Irish women, right? And they worked inside of these factories loading the sticks into these frames, and they got paid per frame that they loaded the sticks into. The sticks would then be cut in half, dipped into the white phosphorus, and then made into matches and then be boxed up, right? Now, these women were working under really screwed up conditions for 3 particular reasons. 1, they weren't given a safe place to eat their lunches or have breaks, right? 2, they were also charged by the factory for any small little fines that they had, were like, oh, you messed up one of your frames. We're fining you not a day's pay, but we're fining you or your frame pay. Oh, you dropped the box. We're fining you. And so these women were working in terrible conditions. But the kicker, the biggest one that they were working around was the white phosphorus itself. Because red phosphorus had been discovered to be just as beneficial as white phosphorus for creating matches, but red phosphorus need a friction strip to strike themselves on. They can't be struck anywhere. White phosphorus also, though, the young women find out, causes a degenerative condition, and I'm going to show you a picture, but I'm going to cover my eyes, and it's called Phossy jaw. This is what white phosphorus was doing to these young ladies' faces. If I zoom in right now, you can actually see some of the Phossy jaw on their faces growing. White phosphorus causes the degradation and necrosis of your lower jaw and for your teeth to fall out. This is a man that has Phossy jaw, right? So these women, they're like, you are not going to find us like this anymore. You are going to give us a safe place to eat our lunch that we're not inhaling this white phosphorus, making our teeth fall out. And you're also going to stop finding us. So they go on a massive strike, right? This is the strike committee of the matchmakers union, right? And this was now allowed, right? This was now allowed as of 1888 for these women to legally go on strike. And they actually had a very massive strike procession. They ended up clashing with police officers at multiple different times, but this action will be successful, and women are going to get what they demanded. These women, these match girls, got what they demanded. They got breaks, a new lunch area, red phosphorus was going to be used by Bryant and Mays to make these things called safety matches, and then also they're going to stop like inhaling white phosphorus, and it's going to dramatically reduce the rates of Phossy jaw, right? So like that was a literal socialist strike, peaceful protest, and they got what they demanded. And who was it inspired by? The Second International Socialist Union, because working men have no country, right? Because the big thing about it, workers, like those matchmaking women, are going to begin to rely more on their vote and their labor movements than they are militancy. This is where Marxism and socialism and anarchism are going to truly split, right? So socialists begin to realize striking, marches, collective protests are going to be the thing that gets us what we want now and allows us to still live in a capitalist society where we make money and can try to make a better life for ourselves. Communists, on the other hand, are mad, and Marxists, on the other hand, are mad because they still want their violent uprising. They want the socialist workers to lash out against the capitalist bourgeois overlords. The proletariat is going to rise up and destroy this, and the objective should be a communist state with no countries, no borders, no flags, no nothing. And they believe that the socialists are kind of selling out, right? The anarchists, on the other hand, are just running around stabbing people, and we'll talk about them a little bit later on. But this is causing that separation between Marxism and socialism, which leads to a very important thing, a thing known as revisionism, right? Revisionism and militancy. So what's going to start occurring is some of these socialists are going to begin to take Marx's ideas and they're going to say, we need to make these more palatable for the modern era. The biggest one that did that was this guy, and his name is Edward Bernstein, right? Edward spelled E-D-U-A-R-D, Bernstein spelled B-E-R-N-S-T-I-N. Edward Bernstein actually wrote a book called The Evolution of Socialism, right? And in this book, he actually describes how we need to make Marxist theories more palatable. And that's where we're going to start class, right? We're going to start class by reading a little one of his excerpts. We're going to compare that to what we know about the manifesto. And we're going to kind of argue our position a little bit and see like a mini Socratic seminar and see like, does this make a lot of sense, right? So, and we'll discuss that a little bit more, but I'll talk to you guys then. Y'all have a great weekend.